Noch immer stehen wir alle unter dem Schock des Überfalls von Russland auf die Ukraine. Die Bilder des Angriffskriegs gehen tagtäglich um die Welt. Das Foto von einer jungen Frau, die in Kampfausrüstung ein Maschinengewehr in den Händen hält und entschlossen in die Kamera blickt, ist in diesen Tagen keine Seltenheit mehr. In der Ukraine verpflichten sich mehr und mehr Frauen für den aktiven Kampf an der Waffe. Sie wollen ihr Land und ihre Identität verteidigen. Sie sind Teil einer wachen Zivilgesellschaft, die sich in einem langen Prozess finden musste, die Errungenschaften der letzten Jahre und Jahrzehnte aber nicht kampflos aufgeben will und für die Zukunft ihrer Familien auch nicht aufgeben kann. Eine freie und offene Gesellschaft ist ohne Feminismus nicht denkbar, das ist unumstritten. Doch nur allzu oft konzentrieren wir uns in Mittel- und Westeuropa hauptsächlich auf die eigenen Fortschritte, ohne die Entwicklungen anderer Länder in unseren Diskurs einzubeziehen. Für diese Ausgabe von Anstiften, dem Podcast der Berliner Stiftungswoche, haben wir mit Anna Dovgopol gesprochen. Sie ist Programmkoordinatorin für Gender Democracy, Women Rights und LGBT Rights im Kiewer Büro der Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung. Sie wirft für uns einen Blick auf die Situation der ukrainischen Frauen und wie sich ihre gesellschaftliche Rolle entwickelt hat. Wie hat sich zudem in ihren Augen der Begriff des Feminismus gewandelt? Außerdem geht es um die moderne Zivilgesellschaft und ihre Errungenschaften, die in der jetzigen Situation vor allem eines benötigen: eine verlässliche Perspektive.
We often compare the situation of women here with the Western situation, but here we often forget that the conditions that women went through, and the countries developed very differently. The feminist movement that the US and this global West, as we call it, experienced, you had the first and the second feminist movement. In this time, we still had Soviet Union. So when we speak about what we've achieved, what we have by now, we have to compare the situation with what we had 20 years before, or 10 years before, and we have to look at our history. And I make this point because this is very important also for the Western audience, for the Western analytics, so that you don't compare what we have in Ukraine now with what Germany has or with what the US has, because the conditions and the developments were so very different. Before 1917, before the Bolsheviks and Soviet Union started, Ukraine, the territories of Ukraine were divided between the Russian Empire and Austro-Hungarian Empire. But Ukraine had quite a lot of autonomy, and we had this modernism tendencies, and the feminist movement of the first wave was developing here as well. It was very well connected with the nation, with the movement for independence and national identity. And this is the quite traditional story for colonial states that have to fight both for its independence against colonies, and Ukraine was basically a colony of, part of it was the colony of Russian Empire, and part of it of this Austro-Hungarian Empire. While the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed, like other empires collapsed in the end of the 19th, early 20th century, the Russian Empire basically modified itself in the Soviet Union, which was never called an empire. And I think this is very important to note and to speak about it as such, because the jure and formally USSR, the Soviet Union was the Union of Independent States, but in fact it was not. In fact, it was center was in Russia, and other republics were very much subjugated. It's important to say that women's movements in all republics in Russia as such played a huge role in establishing the state, and that's why Bolsheviks had to acknowledge this role, and they said, okay, the constitution of the Soviet Union was in fact the best constitution of the time. It was basically women received almost all the rights. So legally, women, everything was very well. And Bolsheviks said the women's questions is solved. We don't need any movements. It is the bourgeois, the American imperialist problems that women have. Women in the Soviet Union don't have any problems. Although, in fact, to make the long story short, there was this double burden that women experienced. Most women, I would say all women except for women of the richest political leaders, they had to work because the households needed money, and secondly, because that was the official policy of the state that women had to build communism along with men. But at the same time, the state did not create enough care for kids. There were a lot of kindergartens, but still not enough. So women still had to do the reproductive work. They came back from work and they had to cook and take care of the children and take care of the elderly. So the role of men in that regard did not change. The men did not take household work. So women basically experienced the double burden. But the state rhetoric was that women enjoy all the rights. Women are equal with men. This is why when the Soviet Union collapsed and all republics and Ukraine became independent, we could witness sort of the backlash. Women said, we want to be feminine. We want to be wives. We don't want to work. And this, and I see it as a swing, that in the Soviet Union, the swing was very much driven to one direction. Women did not fight for the need to work and for this double burden. That's why they said we don't want this double burden. We want to be feminine. So they use this quite traditional rhetoric to demonstrate that they're basically tired of this double burden. All the efforts of the country were thrown to the war industry, basically, and that's the Cold War that actually never ended. Very little attention was paid to the basic needs of people. So women didn't have stockings. Women didn't have normal tampons or any sanitary products. We used, oh my God, when I started having my periods when I was 15, I used basically the pieces of clothes. So I didn't know about pads until my 20-something. And now, I mean, this is really the horrible memories that you go to school and you never know if you would leak, and that is so embarrassing and all that stuff. And women lived in this for generations. The women didn't have clothes, the beautiful clothes. Everybody was basically gray, and you can see it in the movies. So for women, after this Iron Curtain fell, for women, that basically looked as a liberation, that they can wear beautiful clothes, that they can be wives, and they can take on the part of this job. They can be housewives. They don't need to go to work and be housewives. Regardless of the fact that Soviet constitution was in fact quite good for women, there was no obvious discrimination. Women were never actually present in decision-making system. So we have gone quite a long way, and now we have in our last parliament we have let me check. 21% of women, and that's quite a lot. That's quite a lot looking at the past that we went, and also it's important that there is a voluntary quota of 30% of women for a political party. It's not mandatory, but the party gets additional funding if it has women in the top something positions. And a lot of parties actually did, except for some far-right parties. There were 450 professions that were prohibited for women to occupy. These were professions like connected with metallurgy or driver of the metro train. So the logic behind is that the country says the women's primary role is to give birth. And if women occupy these professions, that would be harmful for their mother role. So the state takes this paternal role of telling, we know better what to do. And while I don't think that difficult professions are good for women or for men, and they should be modernized so that they're not dangerous for humans as such, they are also often much better paid. And informal women did a lot of that stuff, but they just didn't get decent payment for this. Because like coal mining, it's a very difficult job, but it's a very well-paid job. And in the eastern regions, for a lot of people, is the only source of income. And both women and men were in fact engaging in this, but men would get much more payment than women being underground. So there was a group of activists, as I said, activists on the ground and women parliamentarians who basically were lobbying for renouncing of this law, and it was cancelled in 2017. And this is also the big achievement. As I said, as I know, in Russia, this law still exists. It started, I think, developing already in the last years of the Soviet Union, but of course, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in late 1990s, the civil society started growing. It was the difficult process because we didn't know how to do this. We lived in the totalitarian country for 70 years. So we looked up at the West, and a lot of groups were copying what the Western countries did. It was successful to some extent. It was less successful because you cannot copy everything. You cannot take everything from a different context and bring it to a new context. So there was and still is a lot of discussion about methods and tools and approaches. The civil society developed especially brightly after Euromaidan revolution in 2014. It was when the society, the whole Ukrainian society basically said that we don't want to be turned to East, and we don't want to be friends with Russia. We don't want to be close with Russia, and this is not our path. We want to be part of the European family with all the values. It was obviously the big discussion what this Euro integration as a concept means. For civil society, that was emphasis on human rights. That was the rights for LGBT people, the emancipation of women. A lot of people in the society did not agree with this. The homophobia is still quite high, so there was a discussion about this. But that was the thing was that it was the discussion. Sometimes it was difficult, sometimes it was more peaceful, but the civil society did play a huge role in the Euromaidan, and after this revolution was over, a lot of activists became politicians. In terms of feminism, we started having women organizations. They did not identify as feminist since early 90s. Feminism came through literature studies and through sociology, basically through academia. There were these prominent sociologists and literature critics who studied in Western universities, and they brought this feminist perspective. Then some women organizations started. Of course, they didn't use the term feminism, I think, widely until 2014. And the reason was quite obvious. in the Soviet Union, they say that feminism is a bad word. It's not only against men, of course, but this is something that they in the imperialistic Western world need. Here, we don't need this. So the feminism was really claimed as a bad word. And we as women's movements worked hard to redefine it. And now, in the recent years, I was member of a jury in one of the local foundations. So I was reviewing the applications, and a lot of women organizations now identify as feminists. So I think that's quite also an internal achievement. We have every March 8th for the we used to have feminist marches and every year in more and more cities, or we call them Women's March, and that was to attract wider, more women to this, because still not all women, even if they have feminist views, they don't identify feminists. But this is again a discussion. It's difficult to track the direct influence of feminism. I would rather say that civil society is more than 50% women, which is a quite understandable fact, because there is much less money and power in the civil society and much more work, which is what women do. There are a lot of women heads of the organizations, not only feminists, but different ones, and they do a lot of legal work and caring work, all kinds of. And also in civil society, also it became much less acceptable other forms of discrimination that could be surprised, but there were, especially for older human rights organizations, were mostly comprised by men, and they were also, even though they were human rights defenders, but they still used to have this conservative views. But now, I guess, civil society is the most progressive and emancipated field of the society, and nobody questions that what women can do. Also, what is also a big achievement, and this is the question about women in war, maybe it was one of your later questions, but just want to point it out because the situation demands. We have 22.5% women in the army who both serve and work there. And this is one of the highest rates, I think, in world armies. I don't know if this is the matter to brag. I wish wars and armies never existed in principle. But since some countries still decide to solve their own problems with the arms, I think this is quite an achievement. The number of women grew a lot since 2014, since the war basically started in the East, since Russia started war on Ukraine in eastern regions. And a lot of women said that they want to contribute. I think if not the war, the percentage would be less, but this is normal. By law, women could not occupy a number of war professions. They could not be officially like snipers and other, sorry, I don't know these terms in English, but I mean these war professions. They could be cooks, but they could not be snipers. So a lot of women wanted to fight, and when they were fighting in the eastern regions during those 8 years, they would be officially registered as cooks, for instance, but in fact they would be snipers. The problem is this, except for the lack of recognition, is that they didn't get decent financial compensation when they came back to the normal life. So a group of women, that was the initiative called Invisible Battalion. They gathered together and they started lobbying the Ministry of Defense, and they succeeded. And it was the real victory, because the Ministry of Defense is one of the most conservative ministries, as you understand. So that law was cancelled, and now women can occupy most, except for the very little exception, most of the military positions, which is really very important. I think the reason that they can do this makes women more visible there. They would do this even without this. Since women do not need to serve in the army, it's their own decision to do this contribution for the country. This is how they want to defend the country. I think a lot of these women will come back as soon as they can. I mean, some will stay, obviously. A lot of will come back. But the fact that a lot of women and children left the country means that the population of the country will become less, like it always happens after wars. There will be fewer people for development, but I mean, generally, the country will lose a lot of its potential. I wouldn't really distinguish here between women and men. I think they all contribute to well-being of the country in their different ways. But I think the emphasis here is on the children who will become the next generation, who will have to invest in take care of the country, basically. And first, they will be very traumatized, and a lot of them will stay abroad. And this is natural because their parents and mothers would want better life for them. So, and if they will stay abroad, the country will lose a lot of the developmental potential. So that there won't be people here to rebuild the country. So this is the big risk, and I really hope, and I just really want this to happen, that after the shooting is over, we will be able to come back, and there will be support to Ukraine, financial support, so that there will be jobs here, so we can come back and rebuild the country. And I think that for most people, this is really the strong desire. Like, I'm thinking that before the war, I was thinking that, or maybe I want to go and work somewhere in Europe or in the US. And now there are so many opportunities. I can go to a lot of countries, and they say, like, my friends from all over, or they say, like, come, we will host you and you can get the job. And I don't want to. I really want to come back to Ukraine. And I hope so. In our foundation, in Heinrich-Böll Foundation, we were allowed to use some of our funds for urgent grants for this humanitarian aid. But I personally hope that it will be only part of the funding, and that we will be able to use the rest of the funding, and hopefully we will get more to support actually the development, the traditional work that our organizations are doing. And I think this is crucial to keep the country and to restore the country, to rebuild it. Humanitarian aid is not enough. It's obviously essential. This is the basic thing, but it's not enough. To rebuild the country, we have to work on development, on the discourse, on strengthening, on investing in organizational capacities, on strengthening the capacities. Probably, since some people will leave or have left, new people will come. So we need to develop their potential. So I think we need to keep the diversity of funding, obviously, and I think that. Some of the organizations will not totally change into aid. It's just so much a long process. Like this German foundation, that our political foundations, it's just not our focus. We will not get there. So it's rather an exception, and I'm very grateful that the foundation allowed for this exception, because this is what people need right now. But some of our partners, they are in Ukraine, they say, okay, we're pretty safe, and we keep doing not humanitarian work, but they do some of their normal work, but a bit modified. And I think this is very, very important because if we stop doing our normal work, we just lose it all. But what I also think is important, and that was also part of the longer discussion, that has started long before, and now rather than as a representative of the foundation, that it's important that foundation or international organizations, donors, foundations are more listen better to the civil society, what the civil society needs support with. There's no situation with the German political foundations, as I know, because we're quite independent and we're quite small. This is why we're flexible. But some foundations, there are these cases that the projects are donor-driven. The organization that comes with money says, look, this is the money for this and for that. You have to do this and that. And sometimes these ideas are totally illogical. They don't make any sense, or they're repetitive, somebody else is doing this, or there will not be any efficient outcome, but still they say, well, it fits better, it fits our agenda, you have to do this. And this is, I think, this is waste of time, money, resource of everybody. I mean, people, of course, agree because that's their salaries and we all need salaries to live. But for development of the country, I think that's very important that international partners work in cooperation, like in real cooperation with the civil society, with people on the ground here, and jointly decide what is best for development, for restoration of the country. Of course, I wish that our cooperation partners stay with us and support the country both in different ways, including financially. Otherwise, the country will just not survive. There are huge economic losses created by the war. Each bomb explosion, that's like millions of dollars.
Vielen Dank für diese eindrücklichen Schilderungen. Das Gespräch mit Anna Dovgopol von der Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung wurde am 31. März 2022 aufgenommen.